I'm speaking with Mike Yeadon, who was a former executive at Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. Mike, would you just please introduce yourself and give us a little bit about your background?
Yes, certainly. So my name is Dr. Mike Yeadon. I'm a veteran of the pharmaceutical industry. I have a degree in biochemistry and toxicology, a PhD in respiratory pharmacology, and 32 years of leadership in new drug discovery in allergy and respiratory, first in a number of large companies, most recently Pfizer, where I left 10 years ago as chief scientist and head of allergy and respiratory research. And over the last 10 years, I've acted as an independent, consulting to several dozen startup biotech companies, and was happy to be able to found and run successfully to completion my own biotech that was then acquired by Novartis. So I'm an independent now, but I'm broadly experienced in the required sciences, specifically the life sciences, required to understand disease pathology and potentially ways to intervene beneficially in those diseases. So everything we're being told has manufactured or has amplified the harm and psychological fear and harm from this virus from top to bottom. So bad testing, lies about the idea that you can be completely symptom-free and yet represent an infection risk to people around you. That is a lie.
Can you speak to that a little bit more? This idea of asymptomatic spread is of course, the whole reason why the world has masked up, locked down, social distancing, all of this stuff rests on that central premise that healthy people can make other healthy people sick. What do you say to that?
So yes, the concept of asymptomatic transmission, as you say, that someone who's apparently perfectly well can represent a health threat to another person who's perfectly well, is simply not true. The total weight of evidence actually that was used to form this idea were, I think, 6 or 7 case studies. A case study is usually an observation of one person. So that's the total data out of 7 or 8 billion people. It's 6 or 7 case histories where someone asserted that a person who was positive by PCR, but according to the report had no symptoms, managed to infect someone else nearby. And when they infected them, it was only that they became PCR positive too. Now, I think the vast majority of these were out of China, interestingly, and I'm afraid anything that's influential that comes out of research in China is approved by the party. I'm afraid that's just the way it's always been. And there was only one substantial claim for asymptomatic transmission in Europe, and I believe it was a subject that had come from China and visited a number of engineering plants in Germany, and it was claimed they infected a lot of people, even though they were, quote, asymptomatic. But apparently, very quickly after that report, it was corrected that the person actually was heavily symptomatic and had been using over-the-counter medicines to try and get through their day. So it really was symptomatic after all. And just like someone with flu or a cold, they'd barreled on through their day and they just had managed to infect people. But I can explain to people very simply why it's not just my opinion and that of other people that asymptomatic transmission isn't true. I can show you by reasoning. In order to be a good source of infectious virus, say it's me, I have to have a lot of virus in my airway. I can't infect you at a distance if I've got a tiny amount. That's because the world's full of pathogens all the time, and you're able to fight them off routinely, minute by minute, throughout your whole life. You have to have an amount, over an amount, such that it becomes an infective dose. And that only happens if you're in close contact with someone who's emitting lots of virus. And in order to be emitting lots of virus, you have to have a lot of them in your body. If you have a lot of viruses in your body, you will have symptoms. It's simply not possible for you to have a high viral load and for that virus to be attacking you and you have no symptoms, and for your immune system to be fighting back and protecting you, and for you to have no symptoms. It's simply not possible. There might be a brief period of a few hours when the virus is growing quickly, the body's just starting to respond. You might not quite notice, you might not feel 100% you're not ill yet. That's called pre-symptomatic. And yeah, I guess it's possible a few people were infected that way. But the idea that transmission, a major contribution to epidemic spreading, occurred in a person that was full of virus and had no symptoms, it's just bunk. And I'll just add one other thing that I think will chime with people, that we are very good at noticing whether someone's a health threat to us, usually a respiratory threat to us. When you come up to a person, a relative or a stranger, without trying, you scan them and you're aware, is their gait normal, is their head normal, are they looking at you clear-eyed, or do they look hunched and a little bit ill? And without thinking about it, if you don't know them and they look a bit ill, you will skirt around them. In a sense, you're socially distanced unconsciously. And so the two things I've just said there, in order to be a good infectious source, you have to be yourself full of virus, you will be symptomatic. The only chance you would encounter someone like that in your community would be, I think, still averted, because if you saw someone stumbling around full of flu or a cold, you'd think, oh my God, get around this person. So it's my contention that there was almost no transmission in the community, because there weren't symptomatic people. They would be feeling ill if they were in that situation. So there were hardly any infectious contacts in the general community. And you know what? That explains why lockdowns systematically across the world haven't done anything. And that's because the places where you do encounter symptomatic infectious people are where they've no choice to be there, either hospitals or care homes or occasionally your own domestic environment. Everywhere else, you simply won't find infectious sources. So when you lock down and smash the economy and civil society, well, of course you don't lower transmission. It wasn't taking place there. Obviously not. So that's where I am on asymptomatic transmission. But yes, you're right. It is a manufactured story.
And that brings me to the second element that enables this doctrine of everybody being a danger. And that is the asymptomatic driver thesis. It rests on very shaky grounds. I was absolutely aghast to find out the poor quality of the science underpinning this idea. One of the seminal papers involved one woman who reputedly infected 16 of her colleagues while asymptomatic. But a tiny little bit of investigation pulled out the reality that she was being treated for flu-like symptoms. And with that evaporates a substantial underpinning of the whole asymptomatic transmission story.
Anyone who's surrounding us, our relatives, our friends, and who shows no symptoms, who's perfectly healthy or appears perfectly healthy, could be a threat. That's what this induces. That's what this fraud, there are asymptomatic infections, induces. It tells us, oh my God, everybody could be potentially dangerous. That is not true. And we know that Drosten, when he wrote this in a preprint, knew that it was not true, because he was referring to a woman from Wuhan who traveled to Frankfurt and who apparently spread whatever virus she had to a lot of people. And she, he claims, didn't have any symptoms. A journalist pointed out that is wrong. She did have symptoms because she was taking anti-flu medication.
We were quite pleased on the 8th of June when the World Health Organization acknowledged this. Maria van Kerkhove again gets up on stage and says, the data show that asymptomatic transmission of coronavirus is very rare.
We have a number of reports from countries who are doing very detailed contact tracing. They're following asymptomatic cases, they're following contacts, and they're not finding secondary transmission onward. It's very rare.
Only to be deflated the next day when she was forced back onto stage to walk back her statement, saying that there's still much we don't know, and our models show us that, and so on and so on. It's utter nonsense. Again, Fauci knew this in the first quarter. He told the world that in the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks.
In all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks.
And again, the literature catches up, and we see that in the real-world data, asymptomatic transmission is not a driver.
So one of the major claims made was that asymptomatic people who didn't have many of the symptoms of coronavirus or none, they were still very infectious or possibly infectious. But this is kind of a weird statement, would you say? Or
if you say somebody without symptoms can infect, that means this person must throw a whole bunch of viruses out when he speaks. In his droplets, there must be a load, a viral load, which must be significant, else you cannot. But how do you make these viruses? These viruses are made by your body cells that have been destroyed. Then the virus comes out. Now, if you do this, the body will immediately recognize this and say, that's and will immunologically react against it, and that's called an inflammation. And if you have inflamed regions, there are 5 cardinal symptoms, but one, it's not only that you get fever and all this, no, it's pain. So if somebody says, I have not felt anything, no scratch, nothing, no symptoms, but I have that is a ridiculous assumption. Imagine, I could walk around and say, oh, I had AIDS for 2 weeks, but I didn't have symptoms, and now I'm fine again, Who would ever, if you can all of a sudden have a viral diseases without symptoms and transmit the disease constantly, this is for our health system a huge problem, because any school pupil who doesn't want to go to school, he can tell the teacher, look, I had influenza for 3 weeks, no symptoms, but I had influenza, so I had to stay home because I would, So it's a ridiculous assumption, and I'm just amazed how everybody is repeating it.
So many people, when you put fear on the table, they're going to default to that because they're thinking about their immediate survival. And so when you start to seed people with the idea that if you contract this, you're going to die, it makes people very worried and says, oh my God, I better get tested, even if I don't have any symptoms, because they're saying I might be able to transmit this asymptomatically. That's never been empirically proven. And in fact, there's only a major study that has been done was done in Wuhan with almost 10 million people that actually proved that asymptomatic transmission does not happen. And it's a study that's worthy of it because they used confirmatory lab testing, right, Dr. Cahill? They used confirmatory lab testing. They did live viral cell culture. They did antibody testing in addition to PCR, and they found that there was a 0% asymptomatic transmission with almost 10 million people tested.
I could talk for a whole day on the things that are going wrong in this paragraph here. Maria van Kerkhove of the World Health Organization, a majority of the world's population is susceptible to infection. And that is the first of 2 key elements that lead to this idea that everyone is dangerous until proven healthy.
This idea, for example, that you can be ill even though you have no symptoms, and you can be a respiratory virus threat to someone else even though you have no symptoms, that's also invented in 2020. There's simply no history of it, and it defies common sense as well.
Back in April, we knew so little about COVID, and this led us to take a lot of extra precautions, including adopting the idea that healthy people can spread disease. This is known as asymptomatic spread, and that's a very scary thought. Now, however, over 10 million cases have been studied, and evidence is rapidly emerging both from Wuhan and the University of Florida, showing that asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic spread are negligible to non-existent. This is a game changer.
When I first heard the phrase lockdown, for example, I hope, like most people, I thought this is a phrase you use in relation to controlling unruly prisoners. It's a control measure. And I think pretty much all that has happened since is to do with control. This myth of asymptomatic transmission, which is simply not true, as I mentioned earlier, in order to transmit a virus to be a good, efficient source of infection, you have to have a lot of virus, and if you have a lot of virus in you, the virus is attacking you and you are fighting back. That process produces symptoms inevitably. It's not just occasionally, it must always happen. And so all people who are very good sources of infection are ill. So the whole idea of asymptomatic transmission, I would think if it occurs at all, it's like 1% or 0.1%, as good as a strong infectious case. So by the time we got to about the third main theme of this pandemic and how to control it, I knew I was being lied to all the time by government, scientists, their advisors, by ministers, people on the TV. And I'm afraid that impression has simply firmed up as time's gone on. And so it's all about control. It is a manufactured story, and it was on that basis that we're all told to wear masks, which don't work anyway. So even if it was true, asymptomatic transmission, masks don't work anyway because they've been tested repeatedly over the years and they don't do anything against respiratory viruses. And that was the justification as well for mass testing. Millions of people who had no symptoms. And of course, as I said early on, when you use tests en masse, a fraction of them will be positive even when the virus is absent. And if you don't take account of that, you'll think, lo and behold, there's all these millions of people who have this virus and they better be self-isolating for days or weeks. This whole thing has terrified people, and it's all a lie. I don't think a single fundamental sort of driving fact about this epidemic has been represented correctly. And it's obvious to experienced scientists like me. And when I've spoken to lots of my peers, they agree. So it's not like I'm an unusual person in thinking as I do. What's unusual is that I have come out and said so. And most of my colleagues have more or less said, my employer or my university doesn't want me to say anything that would be counter to the official line, so I'm just staying quiet. Whereas I decided I wasn't going to do that because something very bad is happening and it's getting darker.